Greetings. We're about to begin chapter 2 of the book Invitation to the Septuagint by Karen Jobes and Moises Silva. And in this chapter, we are going to be looking at the history of the Septuagint, the origin of the Septuagint, and other Greek versions. So remember, the Septuagint, which could be pronounced either Septuagint, like 4 syllables, or Septuagint, but I say Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The Old Testament's written in Hebrew, it's translated into Greek so that Greek readers can read it, and that is mostly what our New Testament writers are using. That's what most of the early church fathers used because they were Greek-speaking people. And so, in the same way that we read the Old Testament in English, they read it in Greek. Our English translations are called things like New American Standard or NIV or whatever. We generally use the word Septuagint to refer to that Old Testament translation. However, and this is how the chapter begins, you kind of have to define your terms because I have very much oversimplified things by saying the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Because the word Septuagint is used to mean a number of different things. There is a certain amount of fluidity to the way that the word Septuagint is used in Septuagint studies and just in common conversation. The word Septuagint can mean a number of different things. There is no one book called the Septuagint. All right, so that just when you're talking about the Septuagint, you're talking about a lot of different things. So you can't just use it to refer to one book, even though we commonly kind of do. You have to know that there's more to it than that. The Vulgate, for example, is the Latin Vulgate is Jerome's translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin. And that became the dominant way of reading the Old Testament for like 1,000 years. Jerome's Latin Vulgate was produced by one man at one time, in one place, Bethlehem, Jerome, the end of the 4th century. The Septuagint is not like that at all. You can't say, oh, the Septuagint was translated by, and then name the person who translated it, or even the group who translated it. You can't name the city in which it was translated. You can't name the time in which it was translated, because the word Septuagint, if you're using it to mean all of the Old Testament translated into Greek, then you're talking about a process with many, many different translators, most of whom we don't know, over many, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years, like we're talking 2 to 3 centuries, and in places that we're not exactly certain where. And so when you're talking about the Septuagint, it's not just one translation or one book. It's a whole bunch of translations. And so when you're talking about the Septuagint, you have to know that it's used in different ways. One way that it's used, the way that I use it, and the way that like the title of this book uses it, is simply the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. And so that would include all the books of the Old Testament, but it also includes some books that actually technically aren't even in the Old Testament, which we'll talk about in a second. But some people use the Septuagint, and it just means basically the Hebrew translation of the Bible into Greek. That is the most general, broad way to use the term. There are other ways you can use it where you're talking about a specific Septuagint, like this right here is Rolf's Septuagint. It is the Old Testament, but it is in Greek, as you can see. And so sometimes I'll just refer to this as the Septuagint. This is my English Septuagint, Net's the New English translation of the Septuagint. And so you can just like use the word Septuagint to refer to a printed edition of the Septuagint. Sometimes the word Septuagint is used, and we'll talk about why, but specifically about the Law of Moses, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Because we have traditions about how the Septuagint was translated that we'll talk about. And those traditions, however, are only about those 5 books. So you'll hear things about the Septuagint or being a translation made for King Ptolemy II for his library in Alexandria. That's not talking about books like Isaiah or Daniel or Malachi. That's not talking about 1st and 2nd Kings. That's just the first 5 books of Moses. And so some scholars, when they talk about the Septuagint, they'll talk about the Septuagint, which is those 5 books. And then for the rest of the Old Testament that came along over decades and centuries later by unnamed translators and in unknown places, they'll just call that the Old Greek, because that's the oldest form of the Old Testament in Greek that we have, but it's not to be confused with the earliest translation, which would be the Septuagint, or which would be the Law of Moses. So sometimes the word Septuagint is used for all of them, but the more precise and technical you want to get, some people will say the Old Testament or the Septuagint just for the first 5 books, and then the Old Greek for the rest. And then you get even more technical and specific after that, because say, for example, the book of Daniel, you have like the Old Greek Daniel, and then you have a later Greek translation called the Theodotion. And we'll talk about Theodotion in a little bit, but basically there are numerous versions of the Old Testament. Just like we have numerous versions in English, there are numerous Greek versions as well. And finally, there are some books that are commonly referred to as part of the Septuagint, like in this book right here, or in this book right here, that are translations of the Septuagint that are not translations at all from the Hebrew. What I mean is, during the Hellenistic period, in between the Old and New Testament, Greek became the common language, and there are some books, like, for example, the Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon is a book that is in these, but, and so people would say it's in the Septuagint, but it was never written in Hebrew. It was originally written in Greek. So it's not a translation at all. It's just a Greek writing. And so to say that the Septuagint is a translation from the Hebrew to the Greek isn't 100% accurate, because there are some books in this Septuagint that were never written in Hebrew. Or like the book of Judith is in those books right there, in those Septuagints. But the book of Judith, while it might have originally been written in a Semitic language, we don't have that. All we have is the Greek. And so it could refer to a lot of different Greek writings. And so there's fluidity with the word, and you kind of have to use context to determine what is meant when the word Septuagint is thrown around. One of the things that causes that confusion, where we tend to think of the Septuagint as just a book, is the fact that while originally it would have been written on scrolls, and those scrolls are all separate, about 35 feet in length or so, and they each contain different books, when Christianity rose to popularity, Christians uniquely started using scrolls less and less, and went for another format called the codex, or the book form. And so when you stop using scrolls and you start using a book, then that means all of the books are put in there together. So if it was a bunch of scrolls, you just have like a big box with 20 scrolls in it or something. But if you have a book, you have to choose what goes in that book. And it's all printed together in the form of a book. And so if you have all of the Septuagint in one book like this, then people start to think, oh, okay, well, that book is the Septuagint. But all of the different codices, the different things that are called a codex, all the different books that we have, when they do have the Septuagint in there, which, for example, like really important ones like Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, those not only have the New Testament, they also have the Septuagint in there also. But their Septuagints might not all look the exact same. There was no canon for the Septuagint in early Christianity, like a set, this is the Septuagint canon. So what books are in there varies a little bit. Also, there was no one set, this is the Septuagint translation that everyone is using. Just like the NIV varies from the King James Version, the Septuagint of Daniel in this codex might vary from the Septuagint of Daniel in this codex. And so there was variation among the Septuagints, if you want to talk about it plural. And so so the fact that it's written in a codex gives you the impression that it's just one book, but it's not actually. There is no one thing called the Septuagint. Some scholars, because of this ambiguity, have argued to try to make the language more precise and come up with standard terminology. Like only use the Septuagint to talk about this, only use Old Greek to talk about this, only use Aquila, Theodotion, and Symmachus and different words to discuss the different translations. But one of the problems that you see is, that doesn't catch on everywhere. Not everyone does that. But also, even in antiquity, the word Septuagint is used to mean all of these different things. And so it's always been an ambiguous word as to what exactly you're talking about, which is why context matters. The word Septuagint itself wasn't even used to describe these translations. Like the Torah was translated in probably 250 BC, like the 3rd century BC. We don't see the word Septuagint used to describe these books until the 2nd century AD. So you're talking hundreds of years have passed. Septuagint is a Latin word meaning 70. And that's why, if you're reading something about the Septuagint, it's often translated as LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70, because that's just what it means, the 70. And that deals with the tradition concerning the number of translators that they had for the Septuagint, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But the earliest record we have of the translation of the Septuagint, when you start talking about the history of it, comes from what's called the letter of Aristeas. The letter of Aristeas is purported to be a letter written by Aristeas to Philocrates, his brother, and he is describing the quite a few things, but one of the things that's described is the translation of the Torah, just the first 5 books, into Greek for Ptolemy Philadelphus II and for his library in Alexandria. So you have Demetrius, who is the chief librarian for Ptolemy, and he sends to Palestine to have the high priest have Hebrew scrolls and translators brought down to Alexandria, Egypt, for this huge translation project. So the high priest sends 72 translators, 6 from each tribe, and they all go to Alexandria. They bear gifts for the king, and there's this huge celebration as they're welcomed into Alexandria. This is the way the letter of Aristeas tells the story. Then they are all sent off to an island to work. The 72 translators work for exactly 72 days, and they produce the Septuagint, which is just the first 5 books. And then they read it to the Alexandrian Jews. It is enthusiastically received. Everyone loves it. And a curse is pronounced upon anyone who would ever change any of the wording of it. That's a common way to kind of like end documents. For example, the book of Revelation. If anyone adds to or takes away the words of this book, God will add to him the plagues or take his name out of the book of life. It's a way of saying, don't mess with what I've written. Well, the letter of Aristeas says that that's what they pronounced upon anyone who would change the words of the Septuagint. And so that's kind of our earliest record of how the Septuagint was translated. Historians doubt a lot of the historicity of that story. It seems like there was a lot of embellishment and a lot of things. For one thing, it probably was not universally received by Jews. Hellenization, like the making Greek of Jewish people, was resisted by a lot. And so some people were probably very strongly against the idea of turning the Hebrew scriptures into Greek scriptures. There is a later writing in a Jewish tractate that says, it happened once that 5 elders wrote the Torah. So notice you can already see differences in the tradition. Instead of 72, it says 5. But it says, it happened once that 5 elders wrote the Torah for King Ptolemy in Greek, and that day was as ominous for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made, since the Torah could not be accurately translated. What they're saying is Torah is perfectly preserved in Hebrew, and if you change the words to a different language, you lose it. And so that day of making it Greek was just as idolatrous as when they made the golden calf in the book of Exodus. It probably wasn't universally received. It is likely that the translation took place. It is likely that the translation probably took place during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus. It was in Greek. It was written in Greek, spoken in Egypt. So there's differences between like Egyptian Greek and Palestinian Greek. And it seems like the people who translate it were actually using Egyptian Greek. So that means the tradition of it being Palestinian Jews who traveled down to Alexandria might not be accurate. It might have been Jews and scholars already living in Alexandria. And there is a debate as to whether the Greeks were involved in it or not, whether there actually was a guy named Demetrius who kind of arranged the whole thing for King Ptolemy. Whether or not King Ptolemy had interest in it or not is something that is debated. Some people think, well, if he has a huge group of Jews living there, he might be interested in their founding scriptures. Others think that that's just a way that the Jews tried to kind of legitimize the Septuagint in the Greek-speaking world, and that stuff's just debated, and we don't exactly know. There are three rather controversial claims kind of consistently through the letter of Aristeas. One is that the LXX, the Septuagint, was meant to supplant the Hebrew Torah. So it was meant to replace Torah. Secondly, is that it was a work of high literary value, and there's debate about how high the literary value of the Septuagint is. And then finally, that it was translated as sacred scripture on par with the Hebrew Torah. So it's just as valid to read the Septuagint as the Hebrew scriptures. Those are the claims made in the letter of Aristeas about the Septuagint, because he's trying to show how great the Septuagint is. He's trying to argue in favor of it and try to get more and more people to use it. Some have even theorized that he's trying to elevate the Old Greek Septuagint above all the other Greek translations out there. Some are saying that there were basically rival Greek, and he's trying to say, no, this one is the one that is perfect, it is great, and that everyone needs to listen to, and it is divinely inspired by God. Let's see. Philo, a first century Jew, is familiar with this story, and he embellishes it a little bit more. But one of the things that he believes is that it is a divinely inspired translation. He actually embellishes it to say that all of those 72 translators translated it individually, and then they put their translations together and noticed that they all did it word for word the exact same. So it was like a miraculous translation where they captured the exactly divine dictation from God, what the Septuagint was supposed to be. So he had a very high view of the Septuagint, and later translation changes the number from 72 to 70, and that corresponds with the number of elders who went up on Mount Sinai with Moses back in Exodus 24. So like, just as Moses received the law, the Septuagint in a similar way comes from God, on par with the Hebrew scriptures given from Moses. So very high view of the Septuagint in a lot of early circles, but that's kind of the story as to how it came about. But that's just about the Torah, the first 5 books. When it comes to all the other books, we don't really have any tradition about how Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, any of that stuff got recorded. And so that's one of the reasons that there's a distinction. When they're talking about the divine inspiration, they seem to be talking specifically about the Torah, and they're not so much talking about the other books that are part of it. Later translations, however, were then made also that rivaled this Old Greek in this Septuagint. We're going to talk about Aquila, Theodotion, and Symmachus. Those are kind of like your NIV, New King James, American Standard. Like, they are your different versions, same language, but different versions that developed. Aquila was a Gentile who, it is said, converted to Christianity, and then after converting to Christianity, converted to Judaism. And in that, he became a brilliant scholar and translator, and he translated the Hebrew into Greek. 3 important facts about his translation that make it stand out. It's based on the Hebrew texts of his day. In his day, we're talking about 140 AD, so the 2nd century, and he's using Hebrew texts from about that time period. He corrects a number of what he sees as deficiencies in the Old Greek Septuagint. But he spent a lot of time arguing against Christians. And so a lot of his corrections, they help solve or answer some of the disputes between the Jews and the Christians of the 2nd century. So I'll just give you one quick example. The word parthenos is the Greek word that means virgin. And that's what the Old Greek Septuagint translators used to describe the Hebrew word alma in Isaiah 7:14. It says, "Behold, a virgin shall bear a child. You shall call his name Emmanuel." He doesn't translate the word alma with the Greek parthenos. He translates it with the Greek word that means a young woman. And so when Christians are debating the Isaiah 7:14, whether or not Jesus was born of a virgin, whether or not that is actually predicting or prophesying a virgin birth, which Septuagint you read becomes important. because some would say, well, it's read Aquila, that's the one that is the most literal. That's the one that, there is no virgin birth prophecy there. And Christians would say, well, your own Jewish translators, were the ones who said that it was Parthenos back then. And so there are debates about which Greek word should be used to render Isaiah 7:14. And Aquila made a translation that solves the problem a little bit if you're a Jew. And then the third important fact is just that he's very rigidly literal, even to the extreme that he sometimes will invent a Greek word to correspond to a Hebrew word, because he wants every word to have a particular correspondence. So if there's not a perfect Greek word for that Hebrew word, he's even there's an example from Psalm 22 where he invents a word, and he'll just try to make it very, very literal like that. Theodotion is a later 2nd century translation by a guy named Theodotion. And his is said more to be an updating or a revising of Greek texts that already existed, and he is revising them to be more fitting with the Hebrew. So that means that there are texts prior to Theodotion that are pretty similar to what he is translating as. And so those have come to be called Proto-Theodosian texts. So we're not sure who translated those or when, but Theodotion seems to have updated and revised them in some ways. And so he gets the namesake for what the translation is called, even though it appears that the tradition he's using existed before him and was an important one. In fact, even in the New Testament, you see some Theodotion leanings in the translation. There's one especially noteworthy in Hebrews 11, where it's giving a list of some of the things that God has done in the Old Testament. It mentions he shut the mouths of lions. That's direct from a Proto-Theodosian Greek rendering of the story from the book of Daniel, which you don't see in some of the other Greek or in the Masoretic Hebrew texts. And so you do see some Proto-Theodosian that existed even before Theodotion that seems to have shaped his translation. But one of the biggest ways that his translation became monumental was in the book of Daniel specifically, because there were a lot of deficiencies in the old Greek translation of Daniel. And so the Theodotion kind of replaced and supplanted it. So if you're looking at the Septuagint of Daniel, you'll see it in several different forms because Theodotion is quite a bit different. And so anyway, that's something that is monumental about his work. And then he also did tend to transliterate more words. By transliterate, what that means is basically you don't translate it, you just write it in the corresponding letters of whatever language you're translating it into. For example, a transliteration of the Hebrew word alma into English would be Alma, A-L-M-A. But a translation would be young woman or something like that. And the same thing with Greek. To translate the word baptizo would be immerse or dip or something like that. But to transliterate it would be to say the word baptizo or baptism. And so he transliterated a lot of words for like plants and animals and things like that. And then Symmachus would be the third, and this was about 200 or so AD. And we don't have a lot about Symmachus, but what we do have shows that it was probably a very, very good translation, that he was probably familiar with Aquila and Theodotion and the Old Greek, and that he used the wealth of variety in Greek to beautifully capture a lot of the meaning and the sense of the Hebrew. So it seems that Symmachus was a very good translation, although of all of them, Aquila and the Old Greek and the Old Septuagint had the greatest influence, and they kind of had lasting power. But other translations were also made that we know a lot less about. Origen, we know, was familiar with other Greek translations as well. But for our purposes, Just know that the word Septuagint has a variety of meanings. Know the history of the Septuagint. We have from the letter of Aristeas. It's also, you have some from Philo, and it deals with Alexandrian Jews receiving this text from Palestinian translators. Not sure how accurate some of that is historically, but that's what the tradition is. But it didn't stop there. Other translations continued to be made over the years, and they are all rendered in different ways. Emperor Justinian in 533, in remarking on what translations are best and should be used, says, "Those who read the Greek shall use the Septuagint tradition." And by that, he seems to mean the old Septuagint, the one originally produced, the old Greek. He says, which is more accurate than all others, but then he also says, we give permission to use Aquila's translation also. So basically, the old Greek is the best. Then he says you can use Aquila's, and those kind of become what is the most popular. But that's kind of your brief history of the language and the tradition of the Septuagint. Anyway, I hope it's interesting to you. We'll go to the next chapter next week.